Hello and welcome to this video, and on this video I'm going to be pitting two giants of the jazz rock fusion genre against each other. I'm going to be pitting the Mahavishnu Orchestra against Weather Report to see which one of these is the greatest. And of course, on this video I will be employing over here, just out of camera sight, my Superi-o-meter, which is a machine I've built which can objectively tell you which the greatest of two things is. The way it works on 10 parameters, and it decides out of those 10 parameters which are the best in each of those parameters, scoring 1 point to each band or artist, or in this case bands. And then it adds them up, and from that, mathematically, we can determine which is the best of these two bands, and then that's it, done, finished, and nobody needs to argue about it again. We're done. So, shall I start off? Oh yes, and then what I'm going to do is, when I get to the end of this video, I will talk about the actual serious relative merits of these bands. It'll be more of a serious conversation. Things I like about these videos is that I can be silly and serious at the same time. So I've just seen my serious voice has now come in, you see. But let's get back to the silly voice. So we're back to the silly voice now. Right, so first of all, I've got to switch on the Superi-o-meter. There we go. Just letting it going, and then we've got to feed in Mahavishnu Orchestra and Weather Report. Right, that's it. There we go. So we have them in. We have them in now, and they should be there, ready to be superiorized by my Superi-o-meter. Copyright Andy Edwards 2023. Right, so first parameter we've got is innovation. Which of these bands created the most new ideas, new approaches, new sounds, right? When we start comparing these two bands, they are two absolute giants of the genre, and they are also two of the greatest jazz rock fusion bands of all time, and two of my favourite bands. This is really, really difficult. To say that Weather Report weren't innovative is a ridiculous statement, but I think the fact that the Mahavishnu Orchestra are there first, what do I mean by that? Well, around about 66, 67, this idea of jazz rock starts to emerge, and a whole bunch of bands come out, but none of those are able to really codify the sound of the band. Miles Davis eventually comes out with In a Silent Way and Bitches Brew, and these albums often get stated as being the beginnings of jazz rock, but anyone who listens to them knows that it sounds nothing like what we think of jazz rock. Now, jazz rock sort of falls into two then periods. We've got the sort of proggy, out there, heavy jazz rock of the early 70s, and then we have the sort of funky fusion of the late 70s. Now, I would say that the Mahavishnu Orchestra pretty much defined that early 70s sound. And bands like the 11th House and Return to Forever really then emerged, you know, completely enthralled by the legacy of the Mahavishnu Orchestra. They come out and really codify the genre in 1971. A whole bunch of artists play a part in creating that sort of Fusaki, funky fusion thing in the end of the 70s, Weather Report being one of those bands. But in the early 70s, they're still pursuing the sort of legacy of Miles Davis's late 60s, early 70s band. So I feel that in terms of innovation, and of course Weather Report, especially in the areas of synthesis, band arrangement, use of the recording studio, are massively innovative. But Weather Report take time to get going. A lot of people think that the first album, Weather Report, is an absolute masterpiece. But I feel it's a good example of a post-Bitches Brew album. I actually think that albums made by Miroslav Vitous and Joe Zawinul at the time are greater than the first Weather Report album. By the second album, they start to gain momentum. When Sweet Nighter comes in, I think that is a very, very important album in 1973, I think, for bringing in the idea of funk into sort of jazz rock. But Billy Cobham's done it with Spectrum. That's a funky album, and there we go back to the Mahavishnu structure. Even there, we could see that the funk's in there, and I would argue if we went back to a track like Miles Beyond off Birds of Fire. So for me, it goes to Led Zeppelin. Yeah, everything goes to Led Zeppelin. I'm looking at this stupid superiometer. I'm looking at the wrong dials here. Sorry, I did use Led Zeppelin to calibrate this morning. I don't know whether this is going to have an effect. So, but you have to. They have to be calibrated in some way. You can't just switch the superiometer on and expect it to work. It has to be calibrated. Right, so innovation goes to Mahavishnu Orchestra, and they get a big point for that. Now let's move on to technical ability. Of course, these two bands represent probably a high watermark in terms of rock virtuosity. Okay, and why? Because they're all jazz musicians, and it's very hard to split between the two of these bands. Joe Zawinul, for example, emerged out of classical music in Austria, but he was very interested in jazz, but he was classically trained. And many of the musicians he grew up with came from the classical tradition. And some of those who went on into classical music have come out and said that if Joe Zawinul had carried on playing in the classical music genre, he would have been one of the greatest classical pianists of the 20th century. He then moves into jazz. He works with a whole bunch of different artists throughout the 60s and proves himself to be one of the greatest jazz pianists of the 1960s. Then he moves towards synthesis, he moves towards composition. He basically writes two of the tunes, one being In a Silent Way and the other being Pharaoh's Dance, which basically compositionally give the impetus to jazz rock, although I would think it would argue that it's the wrong direction. But I think that Zawinul is an example of an absolute virtuoso musician, as is John McLaughlin. So, you know, here we have a guitarist who comes out in the 60s in the London scene and basically redefines technically what the guitar can do, redefines the fusion of jazz and rock and blues. He takes sort of Hendrix's legacy, he takes Coltrane's legacy, mixes them all together and really redefines guitar playing, redefines technically what is able to be achieved on the guitar, and pretty much ushers in the era of the shred guitarist, you know. So in the two leaders of these bands, and I will say that these are the two leaders, we have two of the great virtuosos of all time. So I think technical ability, it's a split between the two of these bands. So the superiometer is awarded half a point each for that one. Charisma. Jazz rock bands aren't known for their charisma. They are known for sort of virtuoso jazz musicians showing their thing. But I think part of the success of these two bands is down to charisma. John McLaughlin was definitely marketed as the great white, spiritually enlightened hope of progressive rock music, progressive music in the early 70s. He was stood there dressed in all white with the double neck guitar, haircut really short, very good looking bloke, very intense. And this was at odds with all the sort of Jimmy Pages and Richie Blackmores and Jeff Becks and all that sort of rock and roll sort of attachments that we saw to the guitar hero in the early 70s. McLaughlin was almost against that stereotype. He's incredibly iconic. When I've done videos about jazz rock, I've often used McLaughlin as the figurehead for that genre. He is that iconic. I also feel that Weather Report didn't really hit mainstream success until they brought in Jaco Pastorius. And Jaco Pastorius is perhaps even a little bit more iconic than John McLaughlin, but we are talking about very iconic musicians. So the point could easily start now to move towards Weather Report. The addition of Pastorius in 1975-76 really seems to coincide with the band propelling itself to superstardom and producing eventually Heavy Weather, which goes on to be one of the biggest selling jazz rock albums of all time. And I think this is in great part to the appearance of Jacko on the stage with Weather Report. I think it created a very sexy focus to the band, right? So I'm vying between the two, but I'm erring towards Jaco Pastorius. But when I think about Weather Report, who else in that band? Zawinul's a very magnetic character when you watch him on stage. There's an intensity there. Who else has been in that band? For a band that's had so many members go through it, this is a lot of jazz virtuosos. There's not much charisma there. With the Mahavishnu Orchestra, I think, as well as McLaughlin, I think this sort of Billy Cobham, the huge muscly ex-Marine in the back with the see-through drum kit, and then Jerry Goodman. Right, so Jerry Goodman is like the stoned hippie of the band, you know. So when I was a kid and I first saw a photograph of the Mahavishnu Orchestra, it was just a photograph of McLaughlin and Jerry Goodman, and those two sold me the band. I think if Jerry Goodman had me stood there with the long hair and the violin and the hippie clothes, I might not have gone and pursued that band. So when it comes to charisma, I think Jerry Goodman and McLaughlin balance Jacko. So I think it's half a point each. And the superiometer agrees. We've got half a point each there for that. So we're now going to move on to composition. Well, I think the Mahavishnu Orchestra's compositions are very, very important. There's a signature sound there. Things like Dance of Maya have a sound all of themselves, which I absolutely love. But I think compositionally, the Mahavishnu Orchestra are often the compositions of vehicles for improvisation. You know, McLaughlin has designed tunes in which he can do this Mahavishnu thing. Okay. I think with Weather Report, composition is much more important. Weather Report compositions sound, especially in the early days, like it's sort of almost like free improvisation, but they're not. They're very strict structures, very complex charts, which the musicians have to negotiate their way through. Weather Report has developed perhaps more different ways of musicians improvising within a composition than any other jazz rock group. The integration of composition with and improvisation, so improvisation becomes part of the composition, is so much stronger than with the Mahavishnu Orchestra. An example of this would be if you listen to something like Birdland. Birdland is this very complex, tortuous composition that takes you on a journey, and within that, improvisation plays a very certain part, you know. So when Jacko comes in and he's playing those harmonics, he's going, and he's playing that and he's bending it and moving it. That theme contains a type of improvisation. And then if we think of some of the sax breaks that then come in, they almost are like they're the melodies of the group. But then if you think of Zawinul's, you know, sort of virtuoso, speedy solo at the end, he's flying at the end of that. So we get all these different contextual uses of solos within Weather Report. I think compositionally, this has to go to Weather Report. Also, Weather Report's use of the recording studio is absolutely groundbreaking. The way they use overdubbing and multi-tracking, which sort of goes against the ethos of jazz rock and jazz, but I think the way they do it is so incredible that I think we have to consider this in terms of the compositional process. So Zawinul is able to use synthesizers and multi-tracking to almost emulate a big band. And there's a lot of big band influence in Weather Report. Often they'll sit you down into that sort of big band shuffle and you'll have all the brass hits, but with the sort of genius of Zawinul's arrangement and the use of synthesized sounds, you never feel that that's what you're listening to. The Weather Report's compositions are incredible, and there's a magic to them. I was listening to Tail Spinning this morning, which I believe is one of the Weather Report's greatest albums. I think it's their third greatest album and never gets the credit it should. And I was just blown away by the compositional, these tracks that start off in a certain place and go towards somewhere that you never expected. Think of a track like Badia. That's incredible composition. So yeah, without a doubt, despite all my love of John McLaughlin's incredible compositions, it goes to Weather Report here. So Weather Report now get a point for composition. And the next criteria, which is production, I think the point goes to them as well. I think they've explained why they get that point, and it's down to the use of the recording studio. Weather Report are absolutely groundbreaking. The Mahavishnu are pretty much a band in a room playing. Now, of course, Visions of the Emerald Beyond is one of the greatest produced albums of all time. It is jaw-dropping. What happens on that album production-wise is incredible. George Martin's work on Apocalypse with the London Symphony Orchestra, production-wise, is an absolute massive achievement. As I'm saying this, I wonder whether it should swing back to, half a point each for this one. But I think those two albums, it's difficult here. One of the problems you have comparing these two bands is the fact that Weather Report made like about 15 albums and the Mahavishnu made basically 3 from the original lineup and 3 from the second lineup. It's difficult to compare this. So there is a big chunk of the Mahavishnu output, which is basically Apocalypse and Vision of the Emerald Beyond, where I think the production is incredible. The first album is not produced well at all, and it's part of the charm of that album. Birds of Fire is well produced. And that's the first time we really hear the Mahavishnu recorded properly. I've always felt that Between Nothingness and Eternity was not a well-produced album, and I think the sort of remaster and remix that's come out more recently has shone a light on that. I think that Apocalypse, yes, incredible, but again, with Apocalypse, it's an incredible achievement, but I always felt that there is a sacrifice in the sound of that album, especially with the drums. Narada Michael Walden, this incredible drumming, you never really hear him properly until you listen to Visions of the Emerald Beyond. On Apocalypse, they could only afford to put a few mics on him and he's stuck in another room, and that drum sound is quite thin. The whole sound of Apocalypse is quite thin. But it's an incredible achievement, to have a real live, jazz rock group which contains a string quartet pitted against the London Symphony Orchestra playing at the same time. It's quite an achievement. Like I said, Visions of the Emerald Beyond is incredibly produced album, and on a recent interview I heard on the radio with Trevor Horn, when they were asking about what influenced his production style in the 1980s, he pointed to he said there's a number of great albums in the 70s that sounded incredible. And he mentioned one album, and that was Visions of the Emerald Beyond. But that one album does not change the fact that Weather Report have produced consistently incredible sounding albums and pushed the envelope of what production can do. So it goes to Weather Report. I think production-wise, yeah, it still goes to Weather Report. So that's what we've got. Another point there for Weather Report. Good. So Weather Report are now fighting back as we move to influence. Right? Influence is different to innovation. Innovation, a band can be innovative but not actually influence anybody. They can come out with a new idea which at the time is not taken up. They can be the first to do this. So an example would be Joe Harriott. Joe Harriott here in the UK was pioneering a type of free jazz at the same time as Ornette Coleman, a slightly tad later, but on the whole he was pioneering a different type of free jazz. But his influence was nowhere near what Ornette Coleman's was. So that's what the difference is here. I think, as we have described, the Mahavishnu should come out and define what jazz rock is. I think the change that we hear in Weather Report that starts to happen in 72, 73, 74 is down to the success of the Mahavishnu Orchestra. Okay, so I really think that in terms of influences, and this is obvious, Jacko's influence on bass players is absolutely huge. And Weather Report, when we listen to bands like Tribal Tech in the 1980s, we can hear that huge influence there. And I think some of the influence that the Weather Report had did emerge more in the 1980s. And I think here's a contentious one. Although I absolutely love Weather Report, a lot of that sort of funky, commercial, hooky jazz thing that came out with Heavy Weather actually was an awful influence that then ruined jazz rock as we went into the 80s. So I think the point here goes to the Mahavishnu. I think that's an obvious one and it can't be argued. Right, now we're down to presentation. This is the artistic sort of view of the band. I think this is really, really important. I think albums, your perception of an album could improve down to the cover. I think of Friends by Chick Corea, which is one of the greatest albums of the jazz rock era. It's an absolutely incredible album. And then I think of Three Quartets. Everyone thinks Three Quartets is amazing because it's got that dark cover with the flowers on. It's very beautiful. But the Smurfs. And so nobody mentions Friends, which is as great. It's as great as Three Quartets. It's an incredible album. But we don't perceive it like that because of those Smurfs. Behind me we've got two albums that sort of came out at a similar time. One by Weather Report and one by the Mahavishnu. The Weather Report one, look at it, it's just incredible. It's a splash of colour and vibrance and it gives me an idea of what that band is like. And then we look at that cover by the Mahavishnu, which is a sort of, is it a naked John McLaughlin sat in front of a sort of spiritual glow, looking, a little bit cheesed off on that cover. So some of the Mahavishnu Orchestra albums covers are good. I really love them. I think In Amount of Flame's okay. It's a match with the band inside. I never thought that was that good, but I like the typeface, and it's dark. Birds of Fire is incredible. Apocalypse is incredible. Visions of the Emerald Beyond, incredible. And I do know the name of the guy who designed that. He's got a name that comes from Sri Chimno, and I'm not going to try and pronounce it because you know what I'm like pronouncing stuff. But yeah, that's very important. But it doesn't compare to the absolute iconic covers of Weather Report. The only one I don't like by Weather Report is Sweet Nighter. Sweet Nighter is okay, but Sweet Nighter is an absolutely dark, swirling, funky masterpiece. And that cover does not sell that album. And the Sweet Nighter title, which was, I think, named after a cure for bedwetting. The whole thing's not quite right. So putting Sweet Nighter aside, and also, what about that? See, I'm talking myself out of it. What about the second Weather Report album? The faceless, characterless second Weather Report album, right? With the sort of red flying letters. They really were lacking inspiration on every level when they came up with that album. Whereas Mr. Gone, which is it's not a great album. It's not a great album. There's no bad Weather Report albums, but Mr. Gone is not one of their best. But what a cracking cover, and it makes you want to like it more. So I think the point here goes to Weather Report, without a doubt. Heavy Weather, that album cover is absolutely iconic. So yeah, we got there. Number one. Okay, right. So we then now move on to popularity. We're talking about two of the most popular bands of all time in terms of jazz rock, in terms of sales. And these two bands were probably the two bands that kept that genre going. The record company saw the sales of the Mahavishnu in the early 70s and were then confident to then put money into all these other bands. And with Return to Forever and Aldi Meola, it paid off. Heavy Weather selling 500,000 copies in 1977. Then, and then almost having a hit with Birdland, that, infused so much cash into this sort of awful Fusaki stuff that then comes out in the late 70s. So, in terms of sales, we're talking about a lot of sales. When you look at the figures, the sales for the Mahavishnu Orchestra are more, right? They are more. And if we were to factor in Love, Devotion of Surrender, which is a Mahavishnu album almost in all but name. The Live Divine I've always classed as being another Mahavishnu track almost. And then if we were to factor in the sales of Friday Night in San Francisco, all right, a John McLaughlin album with Aldi Mail and Paco de Lucia, we're into millions and millions and millions, right? I think the Mahavishnu off the top of my head sold 1.5 million albums. I think Love, Devotion and Surrender sold another 1 million. And I think Friday Night in San Francisco has sold millions and millions. I think something like maybe 2 million, 3 million, it might even be 5 million. Right? Weather Report, their sales are all really down to Heavy Weather. They have sold around 1 million albums. It's an incredible number for a instrumental jazz rock group. But without doubt, the Mahavishnu and John McLaughlin get the point here for sales. So it goes to them. Right, let's go to great to crap ratio. Right, so this is a difficult one. As I was chatting before, right, if we take the Mahavishnu, In a Mountain Flame, masterpiece. Birds of Fire, masterpiece. Apocalypse, masterpiece. Visions of the End or Beyond, greatest album ever made and a masterpiece. That's not a bad run. Their cast-off album, The Lost Trident Sections, incredible masterpiece. You know, when you go back and listen to it, it's a brilliant album. The live album, it stands up as it's like a studio album. It's essential. It's a masterpiece. The only album I think where the quality just drops a little is the one sat behind me, Inner Worlds. And Inner Worlds is an incredible album. I've always argued it's not a bad album. It's a great album, but it's a great album which is a collaboration between John McLaughlin and Narada Michael Walden. If we listen to what Narada does later on his solo album, especially the first solo album, we can hear that influence is very strong. The Inner Worlds is not really. It doesn't sound like a Mahavishnu album, but it's an incredible album. The production on it is mind blowing. It really is. It's one of the greatest sounding albums of all time. I went to see Big Country once, and I got there early and I was sat in the audience and the sound guys were just testing the PA, and what album did they test it with? Inner Worlds. I can remember sat in this huge auditorium waiting to watch Big Country, listening to Inner Worlds pummeling an unknowing audience. So yeah, that's a very strong memory of this album. When we get to Weather Report, like I said, Weather Report never made a bad album, but there are some albums that are masterpieces. The first album is okay. I Sing the Body Electric, masterpiece. Sweet Night, a masterpiece. Mysterious Traveller, masterpiece. Tail Spinning, masterpiece. Black Market, masterpiece. Heavy Weather, masterpiece. That's the era for me. The classic band lineup with Jacko and Peter Erskine, I was never a big fan of. I think Heavy Weather's great, but obviously Alex Acuna's on that album. Mr. Gone is not a great album. Weather Report, not a great album. 8:30 is a great album. Night Passage is a great album. And then we get the last incarnation, the Omar Hakim Victor Bailey Band. And I think there's some really good albums there. But when we look at the great to crap ratio, I think the Mahavishnu just has it. I do. So the point goes there. And then we get to the last one, which is my personal taste. And of course, anybody who's watched this channel will know I absolutely love Weather Report. But I would not be here if it wasn't for the Mahavishnu. They are the greatest band of all time. Absolutely incredible. So, if we now feed all that in to the superiometer, let's get going. Stand back. Here we go. It's calculating. Come on, you can do it. You can do it. Oh, it is a terrifying bit. There we go. There we go. Lovely. So, we have a result. It's not like Yes and King Crimson. We have a result. So, with 4 points going to Weather Report and 6 points going to the Mahavishnu, it is now objectively the case that the greatest of these two bands is the Mahavishnu. You know, I do this as a bit of a joke. I like the idea of a YouTube video where you can do comparisons and top tens and say who's better than others, but you know I know it's a load of nonsense at the same time. So this is a great way of doing this and having a laugh and doing all the comparisons, but it meaning nothing. And when I look at that result, even though I'm such a huge Mahavishnu fan, I feel like it's wrong. I really do. So, second half of this video, I am now going to chat a little bit about these two bands together, because it's quite interesting when you look at them. They both come out of the Miles Davis group, don't they? There's sort of, you've got Billy Cobham and you've got John McLaughlin. They're playing in the Miles Davis. It's got Jack Johnson, and they sort of go towards the Mahavishnu, and then Wayne Shorter and Miroslav Vitas, I out to my area, and Joe Zawinul for Miles's band, Form Weather Report. If we listen to Mountain in the Clouds, which is also known as Infinite Search by Miroslav Vitas, which includes John McLaughlin on guitar, with an incredible version of Freedom Jazz Dance. You've got to check that out. McLaughlin is his most firing out there. We almost have a sort of early incarnation of the Mahavishnu and Weather Report together in one unit. McLaughlin also crops up on Supernova by Wayne Shorter. So there's this sort of, they're both bands sort of come out of this stew, okay? Miroslav Vitas came from Czechoslovakia. I didn't say that well. She came from Czechoslovakia. See, I can say it. And was friends from a very early age with Jan Hammer. They had a group together with his brother Alan on drums. It was Miroslav that suggested Jan Hammer to John McLaughlin, all right? But the reason why he suggested it is because he'd actually got in contact with John McLaughlin, and he had said, and I'll put myself off here because you've noticed I've now actually mastered saying John McLaughlin. I can say that's the best you're gonna get. So pronunciation Nazis, that's the best you go. I have you know, given in to those anal retentive pronunciation Nazis that come and plague my comment list and tell me as though I don't know that I pronounce it wrong, even though I don't think this McLaughlin thing that they do, right? If you go and listen to the way John says his own name, which he recently said on that PRS video, he said John McLaughlin. That's what he said, and that's what I'm going with now. Anyway, let's get back on. So, when Miroslav contacts John McLaughlin, the reason he's doing so is because he's asking McLaughlin to join Weather Report, and McLaughlin then turns around and says, no, I'm forming my own band and I need a keyboard player. So this is the stew that these bands come out of, right? I think that John McLaughlin and the Mahavishnu have a vision in 1971. What they do sounds completely unlike Bitches Brew, In a Silent Way, Supernova, or Zawinul's first solo album. It's a break. It's completely different, and that sound's going to be so important. I have a really contentious view is that I don't rate the first Weather Report album that highly. There's a snotty contingency within jazz that want to say that the first Weather Report album is the best one because it's so ethereal and beautiful and tasteful, and it doesn't have all the sort of commercial posturings that came on later with Heavy Weather when they just became a riff-based band, you know, just searching for that sort of commercial hook that could sell on the dance floor, or whatever they want to say about Weather Report. Now, Weather Report get better, there's no two ways about it. Compositionally, I think Zawinul and Wayne Shorter at this point, it's brilliant stuff, especially Wayne Shorter's. Wayne Shorter's compositions are better on the earlier albums. He sort of takes a step back, and this is insane saying that, because when we listen to something like Black Market and Elegant People, this is one of the greatest jazz rock compositions of all time. But I just don't feel that first album they just haven't conceptualized it right. It always sounds to me that they don't know quite what they're doing on that first album. Now that could be in this concept that they had, which is that everyone solos and nobody solos, you know. And I got to be honest, when I hear the first album, I just want someone to bloody solo, right? When they come out with I Sing the Body Electric, this is an absolutely incredible album, and it's incredible on two counts. One is The Unknown Soldier. For me, compositionally, Zawinul's come on and said, right, this needs structure, right? And this is almost like a prog track, and it's just mind-blowing. And also on side two, we get all that live stuff, and we suddenly hear the burning ferocity that Weather Report could instill. You know, they can play an intensity which is equal to the Mahavishnu structure, but we don't hear it straight away. We hear it on I Sing the Body Electric, you know. And if you then go and check out Live in Tokyo, from which those bits were pulled, which came out in the 90s, it's just mind-blowing. That, for me, is when Weather Report are born, and they're burning. It doesn't burn. I like my bands to burn, and that first album doesn't burn. So the thing with Weather Report is there's a slow evolution here, moving on. Sweet Nighter, Zawinul brings the funk in, and God, that's a funky album. Then I feel that with 4 albums in, with Mysterious Traveller, suddenly we have, in 1974, right? And in terms of jazz rock is virtually over in 1973, right? That's a period that runs along progressive rock, and by 73, 74, it's over. The record companies are still going to pour money into it, and they're going to have some big successes, but the innovation has happened. This is where Weather Report take over with 74, with Mysterious Traveller. They have a sound there. That they emerge with that sound. The follow-up to that, Tail Spinning, it's just such a monumental album, and it never gets the credit. On that album, they drop this idea of everyone solos and no one solos. This is the album where they really burn, and there's a couple of moments on Between the Thighs where Wayne Shorter is just wailing, and I think it's on Badia on side 2 where Joe Zawinul is just wailing. It's a very rare moment on a Weather Report studio album where you hear them just, take off. By the time they get to Black Market, there's some incredible blowing on that as well. I'm thinking of them, Herondew, they're really playing. But they've now innovated a way of everyone soloing and no one soloing, and it's within these incredibly complex compositional structures of the band, So Black Market, we hear that emerge, especially on a track like Cannonball, which is absolutely beautiful in its compositional brilliance. And then by Heavy Weather, they've taken all that and they really locked it, and the compositional strength of Heavy Weather produces hits records. It always upsets me when people point to that album as sort of being like a very commercial album, because there's tracks on that where they're blowing as hard as anything on Tail Spinning or Black Market. At that point, I think Weather Report are done. Mr. Gone, Zawinul sort of takes over the band. They can't seem to settle on a coherent lineup, and Zawinul sort of takes over, and it becomes a sort of overdub fest on that album. The Jaco Pastorius, Peter Erskine band's incredible live. 8:30 is incredible, and some of the other stuff that came out from that period. They're an incredible band to see live. Jaco Pastorius is just killing it. But I feel with Mr. Gone and the album Weather Reports, and I feel like I'm missing another album out there, aren't I? Am I? Another studio album? But Night Passage is the last truly great album, and even that's got some questionable things on there. I think the 80s albums are great, but they don't have that sort of innovative, influential brilliance of those albums, that run of albums that I described earlier on. But what's interesting is the Mahavishnu, who've peaked very quickly, and then by 2 years after forming, are completely gone, like burnt themselves out. Then John McLaughlin forms the second Mahavishnu, which I think is as great as the first, but by 76 that's burned out, another 3 years and that's burned out. 76 Mahavishnu is gone, You know, John McLaughlin's now going off on another journey. And 76 is where Weather Report sort of take over. And the great handover of the baton is, for me, Narada Michael Walden. Because Narada Michael Walden, you know, in 76, as this album here is being recorded, goes into the studio with Weather Report and puts down 2 tracks, including Black Market, which for me is the finest moment of Weather Report. It's my favourite track, I think. I just love Black Market. And what I hear on that, I hear the propulsive brilliance of the Mahavishnu influence drumming of Narada Michael Walden with Weather Report, right? Someone put a comment up yesterday about King Crimson, and they said the greatest King Crimson track ever is on Robert Fripp's solo album, and it's Disengage, which features Narada Michael Walden on drums. Narada, if you're watching this, that's twice now where you've gone into 2 of my favourite bands and produced their best track and then left, you know. And I think Narada Michael Walden was offered the gig with Weather Report, but he decided to join the Tommy Bowling Band. So we have this thing where there's a sort of link at the start, and there's this link in the middle with Narada Michael Walden. So these bands are much more intertwined than you think when you explore their legacies. But we are talking about 2 of the greatest legacies. So at the end of this video, I want to say, although the superiometer is erred on the side of the Mahavishnu, and I wanted that to happen when I did this video. I wanted the Mahavishnu to win. So, excuse me. So, I was really pleased when they did. But as soon as I saw the result, it's like, you know, you shouldn't, you know, what's the phrase? You shouldn't wish for what you want, or whatever it is. That's not the phrase, is it? Oh, I'm filming this very early in the morning. I was so excited about doing this. I got up at 6 o'clock in the morning. It's 6 o'clock in the morning here. And I think I'm not, I don't know. I've got to the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed this one. I think I've been a little bit overawed on this video, trying to you know, discuss 2 of my favourite bands. I felt that the whole thing's been a bit sacrilegious. I think I've overstepped the mark here. I think the jazz fusion gods may not look kindly on me. I don't think it's right putting Weather Report down as I have done. And I don't mean to do that. They are one of my favourite bands, one of the greatest bands of all time. I was listening to them last night. I was listening to Tailspin, and I was in awe. The beauty of those chords and those melodies. Wayne Shorter's incredible saxophone sound, which is in like any other sound. It's just a signature sound. You know, Zawinul's incredible vision. The beauty of the playing. You know, Alphonso Johnson's incredible bass lines, you know. And then one of my students posted a video of them playing, and they said he's some Marcus Miller, and in that Marcus Miller playing I could hear the bass riff to Cucumber Slumber, and I went and had a listen to that as well. What a bass line, what a sound. So yeah, anyone who thinks that I have been, you know, maligned Weather Report, that I really didn't mean to do that. It's just the way the superiometer works. This is the problem with the superiometer. It's a dangerous thing. It's a dangerous thing. I fed into it yesterday socialism and capitalism in to see which one was the best out of those 2 political systems, and I dare not say the results. I dare not say the result, but all I'm going to say at the end of this is, if you like this video, then like it, and if you want to subscribe, please do that, because it will make the algorithm work and more people will look at me, which will make me more money, which I think is a fantastic thing. And if you want to, you know, give me more money, then one way of doing that is by becoming a Patreon. You can click on the link below and you can go there and get 7 days free of my Patreon, where you don't have to pay a thing. Now that's a good deal, isn't it? That's a good exchange of, you know, my skills and knowledge and brilliant presentation and wonderful, you know, work I do here with your hard-earned cash, which you've exchanged, you know, in a negotiation between your employer or your self-employment to get your money, and then pass it on to me. So bring all the money towards me, and I'm just going to pat the superiometer on its whatever I'm patting over here. You have done an incredible job, superiometer, of really. This is something here with this superiometer. This is something that I feel is a real bonus to my channel. It really is, because now I'm the one music YouTuber out there that can objectively tell you what's good and bad, and no one else can do that. So that's a very important thing. So tell your friends about it and get them to come and get them to like it, and then get them to put comments up and do all that thing, please. Come on algorithm, YouTube algorithm, we need you so bad. Right, done, finished. Thanks for watching this video. I'm going to move on and going to film the next one now. I'm on a roll now. I'm on a roll. Yes, great. It's at 6 o'clock in the morning. I haven't had any coffee. This is me without coffee. Right, the last superiometer video I did with copy. Go and have a look at the... I can't even speak today. Blah, blah, blah. Sorry. Tried my best, but I hope you enjoyed this video.